Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in our three-part series on challenging sexual violence against immigrants in the workplace. My name is Debbie Smith, and I work at the International Office of SEIU in Washington, D.C. as an Associate General Counsel in Immigration Law. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know there's so much going on in the locals, and today there are actions in the Fight for 15 in many cities. So thank you for taking the time to participate in today's webinar. I'll be introducing the webinar today, and I wanted to introduce you to today's speakers. For those of you who participated in the first webinar in the series, you've already met our incredible speakers, Lauren Bonds, Giselle Haas, and Sonia Parras-Conrad. But today, these three speakers will be joined by Jennifer Cooley. Just to quickly introduce everyone, Lauren Bonds worked as an attorney in SEIU's International Legal Department for 4 years and worked on our Fight for 15 campaign. Lauren is now the legal director of the ACLU of Kansas. Lauren, thanks so much for your recent work in helping stop the deportation of a professor in Kansas who was arrested by ICE. Jennifer Cooley is a professor of Spanish and the head of the Department of Languages and Literature at the University of Northern Iowa. She's published a book, a play, and several articles on gender, social status, and immigration. Her research with migrant women is essential to her work, including the interactive theater pieces she creates to educate about the impact of workplace sexual violence. She's contributed to publications including Stop the Workplace Sexual Violence. And our other speaker, Giselle Haas, is a psychologist in the Washington, D.C. area. For the past 23 years, she's worked as a forensic expert in family and immigration law for local and national attorneys, nonprofit, and government agencies. She was an associate professor at Argosy University in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, and she's currently an adjunct professor at law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sonia Parras-Conrad is an immigration attorney in Iowa and the co-founder and president of ASISTA, the organization that's organized this webinar series. And Sonia's played a key role in representing immigrant survivors of sexual violence in the workplace, including her amazing experience representing workers after the Postville immigration raid, the biggest raid ever in ICE history. Sonia's experience and guidance is a huge contribution to this work nationally. And Sonia, tell us a little bit about the housekeeping for people who have questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Debbie, for all those kind words and introductions of the speakers. And for all of our participants, you have your control panel, and we want to make sure that you use it during our presentation. If you have doubts, if all of a sudden you think of something that you need, we're here to help you, and you can use our chat. We're here live with you, and we'll be able to be responding through chat. You can also use your questions. There's a little bar that says questions, so you can do more formal questions through that that button in there. And finally, we are going to be using polls. When we play the polls, please participate so we can have more of an interaction with you, and we can address whatever questions you have and need according to your answers to the polls. We sent you some homework. If you had time to look at that, that's great. If not, I think you'll be fine as well. And Maria today is recording the webinar. I want to say special thanks to Maria, who has been working on all the technology and the technical aspects and coordination of this webinar today.
Thank you, Sonia. Thanks, Sonia. And then now we'll go to the next slide, please, and just take a quick look at some of the project goals. We hope that this webinar series will help SEIU organizers and staff in a number of different ways to help us develop the tools to identify immigrant survivors of sexual violence, to help us learn best practices for interviewing immigrant workers who have experienced sexual violence, and to help us understand the legal remedies that are available to workers and help gather evidence for those legal proceedings. But another really important goal of this webinar series is to develop partnerships with the anti-violence advocates like ASISTA to fight against and challenge workplace sexual violence against immigrants. Going to the slide on today's agenda, just want to talk a little bit about and give you a heads up about what the agenda is going to be for today's webinar. Sonia is going to be talking about basic interviewing techniques when working with workers who have experienced sexual violence, keeping in mind the power imbalance between workers and employers. And Giselle will talk about some of the safety considerations, things to keep in mind when working with some of our members who have experienced sexual violence, and best practices for interviewing those with those safety considerations in mind. Jennifer, walk us through a video. There's kind of an echo. Does anybody else hear that? Okay. Using some of the tools and giving us an illustration of how to work with people who are suffering sexual violence. Lauren will discuss the legal requirements for an EEOC charge and how to develop the evidence, proof of sexual violence, how to file and win a complaint. And Sonia will end the discussion of building partnerships to fight for workers who have experienced sexual violence. Lastly, just remember there's one more webinar in this series, and that will be on March 8th about legal remedies, and we'll be having, in addition to Lauren, we'll be having lawyers from USWW and 32BJ who will be talking about some of these issues about remedies for these sexual violence against workers. So thanks very much, Sonia.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much. And Debbie, I'm not sure if our participants can see the screen right now. So I
it looks like it's on the first slide, right?
It's frozen, no? It's frozen in
there?
Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
I mean, because I can maybe show my...
oh, there you go.
Did it happen? Perfect. I was ready to go. Alrighty. So I just want to talk to our participants briefly about tips on interviewing. Our amazing professor Giselle Haas is going to talk more about the clinical perspective of trauma and things to consider when talking to survivors and trying to develop the story, which is crucial for building the case and achieving justice, which is at the end what we are all looking forward and helping to do, survive the abuse and, you know, have a chance to obtain and remedies and for justice to be done. So so I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about things that have worked for me, because I'm not a psychologist, I'm not trained on these things, so I'm just like any of you trying to get the story out. And if you can go to the next slide, Maria, por favor. So the first thing that you need to think when you're interviewing somebody or helping somebody is, what is her story? What kind of experience has she had in her past life that has impacted her? And this is going to be crucial to understand whether she's minimizing the horrendous abuse that she has endured now in the workplace. And here's a little spiral that was developed by the Asian Pacific Islander Institute. We use this a lot with survivors. I use it. I have it in my materials when I meet with them and we start talking about what is it that she has experienced in the past. And this kind of shows the continuum of gender violence that some women experience from the time they're born to the time they're talking to you now. some survivors are coming from countries where, there were sex-selected abortions and women were not worth it. They didn't mind, or they don't mind actually today, right? Where boys are eating first because they are the ones that are going to the fields and they are the important ones in the family to be able to bring resources home, and girls are the last ones to eat because they're not as important. They are the last ones to go to school. They're pulled from school earlier. So those kinds of experiences affect the self-esteem and affect what you think about yourself in terms of comparing your experiences with men and the rights men may have over you. So we need to help survivors to break through those models as we're trying to assist them. But we need to know if that is true in their place. Talking about their childhood, how did they experience? Were they abandoned? I don't know how many survivors we work with where parents had to leave to the U.S. to be able to maintain them or sustain the family, and they feel abandoned, or they were indeed abandoned. They were the fruit of an incest relationship or a rape, and they were not important, and that continuous message stays with them today. So again, we're not psychologists, right? But we need to understand the context for the survivor and telling her story, right? As a teenager, we know and we're familiar with the gang activity that is happening today and has been happening for a long time. Is she or was she recruited as a gang girlfriend, las novias de las gangas? Were there any initiation rape, forced to get married? Was there any cyber stalking, or is there any cyber stalking by boyfriends? Was she forced to prostitution? Was she harassed? I will always remember, when working with a younger woman as a young adult, talking about her experiences in applying for jobs. And she brought me, after we worked and we were done, she brought me a newspaper from Mexico. And the advertiser said, textually, like this is the words that were used, se busca señorita de buen ver. So the words in the advertising was, "We're looking for a good-looking woman." That was to begin with, how you had to present yourself and what was the expectation of you, and the subliminal message as you and your image, as a token, as just something material, right? As an adult, has she experienced domestic violence? One of the things that I know that I encounter a lot when working with my clients is trying to break down the pieces of violence in her life to determine which is the most urgent. Is she going home and is it being beaten tonight, or is being raped by her cousin, or is the violence that she's experienced at home, or the harassment by the landlord. And this is the reality of some of the survivors. And we need to understand this, because that way, it's harder to be prejudicial and to quickly go into judging who we're working with, right? Making assumptions. So knowing all these things helps, again, gathering evidence, understanding what kind of services she needs, safety issues, etc. So, in some of the cases that I worked with, they had to lie to their husbands because they were in an abusive relationship, and say that they were coming to learn about being a better mother and helping kids in school. And that was a meeting. And that wasn't the meeting. That was a meeting with me to address the sexual violence in the workplace, right? Or the support group in domestic violence. So anyways, I just wanted to make sure that if anything you get from my spiel, my 10 minutes spiel right now, is the memory of this spiral, because this is going to help you understand a lot her choices, the help that she needs, and the trauma that she has endured. And if we can go to the next one, Maria. And here we go, Paul. Let's play. Okay. And I say let's play because, okay, go backward, Mari. So okay, here it goes. So, and this is from a real case, okay? So Leticia wants to get a raise. By the way, it's not the name was not Leticia. The supervisor asks her to sleep with him in exchange for a raise. If she does, is this consent? Okay, so could you please vote? You can see in your sidebar. Oh, you're awesome. Okay. I thought nobody was voting because I see a lot of 0%, but no. Okay, so I guess I close the poll right now. I'm closing the poll and sharing the results. Here it is. So can everybody see it? Okay, so the answer is no, never. Can we go back to the slides, Maria, please? I'm going to hide the results. Oops. Sorry about that. Can we see the slides again, Maria?
¿Me pone slide?
Yeah, I don't see the slides on my screen anymore.
The result?
Okay, so I'll just keep on talking anyways. So you're right. No, never. If Leticia sleeps with a supervisor, that's sexual harassment, maybe sexual violence, depending on what happened, right? And I just wanted to say this because I had personally struggled with this in one of my cases, in the DeCoster case, where some of the survivors, it was crystal clear that they were forced and raped. And this woman took a long time to come to me. And when she finally comes, she says, I'm not sure I qualify because I actually did have sex because I wanted to. And my reaction was, well, if you wanted to have sex, well, that's good for you, until she went on and I went on with more questions. Okay, who was it? And what was the role in your place of employment? And what was the conversation about? And unfortunately, this turned really violent because the supervisor, since she consented once, went on to force her to have sex in the coolers, and it got pretty nasty because and her doubt in her mind was, I deserve it because I said yes once in exchange for a raise. So now anything that is coming to me is because of me. It's my fault, right? So, obviously you will not have the same kind of situation because you all answer perfectly that survey. No, never. All right. So coercion is an act of getting someone to act or think in a particular way by using uh, or threatening with negative consequences for not compliance. In this case, the threat or the negative was not getting the raise, which in terms meant, not being able to sustain her children, etc. So if we can go to the next one, please. So just before I stop my spiel, if we can go to the next one, Mari.
That
I
one?
just wanted to, yes, thank you. I just wanted to remember or remind everybody that repetition is important. You're going to hear from Giselle and other presenters what women go through, what happens when women experience or men experience trauma, and that sometimes it's important to ask, what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and repeat it because it develops. The more the person trusts you, the more it develops. Um, we don't start conversations because then we will scare the heck out of women, right? We don't start conversations by saying, "Hey, so by the way, have you experienced sexual harassment?" Because they may not know what we're talking about, or sexual violence, or if she's thinking, well, I consented, I wanted it, I wanted my raise, then it may not disclose what we need to get into, right? So these are some conversation starters. If we can go to the last one, Maria, the next one, sorry, that have worked for me. So a step removed from the conversation. Don't ask directly, have you, let's talk about you. Sometimes it helps when we talk about the environment, supervisors, coworkers, what they're seeing, what they have knowledge of. If they have made observations about other women, and if, in some cases, women talking third person, like it has happened to someone else, to later disclose, well, it wasn't to my friend, it was to me. So again, removing the pressure from herself and talking about environment and whether supervisors are mistreating other women and what is happening to other coworkers helps to start the conversation. Another thing that I have experiences, women have come to me complaining about money, whether they were not getting paid or not getting all the overtime that they were supposed to, and that led into the conversation of, again, the environment, the treatment, and the sexual harassment later on. So talk about the supervisors or anyone with perceived power. Laura is going to talk in a little bit who, are we talking about in terms of sexual harassment and sexual assault. How does the supervisor treat the person? Are there any threats? Are there any mistreatment to peers or self, etc.? So here are some tips on, how to start conversations without being too threatening and too on point and shutting down the person because you start talking about things that make her uncomfortable, that are traumatic for her. If we can go to the next one, Mari. And ultimately, remember that the main principle in everything that we do to try to help is do no harm. It is her choice, and we need to empower survivors through the process to make sure that we present all the potential um, help and remedies and assistance that is available to her, and that we respect the process and her rhythm. So this is a little diagram that you can use with people that you're helping to understand better what are the threats that she's experiencing, what is going on at home. That's the inner circle, right? Is she in an abusive situation? Does she have 8 children and it's mission impossible to even risk to talk about what is happening at work because she won't be able to provide for her kids? Are there any physical injuries, so psychological injuries? What happened in her past? How is she perceiving what is happening to her today in comparison to the history of perhaps victimization coming from her country of origin, going through the border and immigrating into the United States if you're working with survivors? What are the other threats? Is immigration a threat? Job security? Again, feeding the children, getting to work. We had a case where the supervisor who was giving rights to the women was the perpetrator of sexual violence, and she couldn't get to work unless she took that ride. Is she residing in the farm that is provided by the employer, and she has no other way to find another place? Is she going to lose her house if she talks about what is happening to her? And then all the things that you know so well that are the threats that are coming from the industry itself, the rhythm of work, the stress, the chemicals, protections, working in isolation, etc. And once you get to know all those threats, you're able to start looking at, the safety. Who can provide safety? Who can provide assistance? What are her choices, etc. Um, and then my last point, in terms of consideration for you working, if we can go to the last slide, Maria, is, as you're working on this, remember that you have to educate yourself and you have to educate your coworkers and people that you work with. You need to learn how to advocate in a safe way and have a good system for referrals that is safe and secure. And we'll talk more about who can help you. What are the unusual allies that can be there present working with you? And with that, I think Giselle is next. Giselle?
Thank you, Sonia. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and presenting this for you. The next slide. What I would like to remind you is that talking to a survivor about her experiences that have been of sexual assault and experiences of sexual harassment that have been very traumatizing is really a very consequential type of interview. It can be really unforgettable. It can be inspiring for them as well. It can have all kinds of consequences. And your attitude will really send a message to them. It will send a message that you respect them, that you listen to them, that you can talk about it. It is okay to talk about it. And a very important message also is that you're not going to get scared from hearing what she has to tell you. A lot of times you will hear survivors that you will ask them, did you tell anybody about this? And they will say no, or I didn't, or I only told my sister, or I only told someone, a friend. And many times when you ask them, why didn't you? They will say, well, I didn't want to burden them. I didn't want to make them suffer what I was going through. I didn't want them to know, how much this was hurting me. And this kind of feeling is their fear of burdening someone else, of making you feel scared or really stressed out by what you're hearing. So one of the important attitudes that we can have is to really send a message that whatever they tell us is not as scary for us. We understand that, and what we think most importantly is about her safety and what matters to her, no matter what may have happened. Very often, survivors have really, really a very hard time to talk about it. And that has to do precisely with the fact that the way that our mind deals with trauma is trying to put it away, is trying to not deal with it. Because people have to raise their kids, have to do everyday things, have to go on with their life, have to have a job, have all these responsibilities. So it's very natural that it would be very hard to start approaching these topics. Also, they feel embarrassed. They really may feel ashamed of what happened to them, both because they couldn't stop it, or maybe because they may erroneously think that they had a role in it, or because it just happened a while ago and they don't want to bring it up. And also there are taboos about talking about sexual matters. A lot of the women that we see were never really educated on sexual matters. We're not street smart about how to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. So they feel embarrassed, they feel ashamed. They may have taboos about using certain words or about talking about certain activities. I have a lot of survivors that will say things like, well, he used dirty words or he used ugly words. And it will be so hard for them to actually say it, to actually use those words to help me understand what it was. Next one. One of the three main components of doing the interview are to provide a structure, to provide safety, and to give the survivor control. Because those are exactly the three things that fail to be present when the harassment or the sexual assault occurred. So we're going to make sure that we give her a structure. We're going to tell them, you're going to provide a safe environment. We're not going to judge. We're going to make sure that we're in a safe place where other people may not hear what we're talking about. We are going to provide support and validation. Next one. We are also going to explain. There was one. Okay. Explain what is it that we're doing? What are we going to do with the information? If we are using a translator or an interpreter, then we're going to explain why are we using this person. explain confidentiality. What is it that we're going to do with the information that we gather? Sometimes, as the interview goes on and the survivors start feeling more comfortable, she may start saying things that she had never said before, or things that later she may regret. And we want to make sure that she understands, not only from the beginning, but also later, that we are going to be using this information. Because sometimes, later we don't want her to come and say, why did you talk to a certain person about her abuse when I told you about it? I thought that was private. And maybe that's not what we said. We're going to explain that we're going to be taking notes, and we're going to provide the means to reach out to us after the interview in case that she has questions, she thought about something else, she regret having said something, any kind of questions. We are going to allow times and breaks. We are going to watch for subtle clues, seeing how she's feeling. One of the ways that we can see if she is being triggered, meaning that the interview is being re-traumatizing, is through the nonverbal behavior, meaning her expression, her eye movements, her body language. Is her speech becoming pressured and fast and urgent? And is she starting to cry? Is she looking around like someone is going to hear what I'm saying? Or if she starts talking in the present tense about the experience, such as instead of saying, my supervisor told me, she will say, he's telling me this and the other, as if it is happening at that moment. So we're going to watch for that. And we may want to slow it down. We may want to say, how is this feeling for you right now? Do you want us to slow down? Do you want us to talk about something else for a little while and then come back? Are you okay with right now? Just to show understanding. Watching for dissociation means when a person is really becomes paralyzed. She looks and stares and she's unable to go on. And at that point, we just want to bring her back to where we are. What happened is that her mind is going back to that situation and she's unable to use her words to explain what happened. So we just want to maybe touch her gently or say, call her name and say, are you okay? Is this okay to talk about it right now? Again, should we go back to this a little bit later? Next slide. We want to give her as much control as possible, always asking if it's okay to go on, we should stop right now, if she wants to take a break, if she wants to talk about this right now, let her set her pace as much as possible, allow her to tell her story in the way that is better for her, that it works better for her, even if we have to come back later for some of the details. Next one. In general, the best way is to use explorative questions. And that's what Sonia mentioned, bless you, about just open questions, talking about your work, talking about things that will help her expand the story. And what else happened? And tell me more about that. Just gentle questions. I wonder if you could tell me da-da-da-da. Will you be comfortable telling me what happened to you during da-da-da-da? Things like that. Next one. Interviewing techniques. What is going to happen during the interview is that there may be some psychological processes that affect the interview, the flow of the interview, the quality of what she's saying. That will be when she has intense distress, relieving the trauma, avoiding those memories at all costs. Oh, I have to go. I'm not going to be able to stay any longer. Can we do this another day? Or feeling too ashamed to speak about it. She can have sleep or eating disturbances that not necessarily affect the interview at the time, but that may have consequences. Like, I'm not going to be able to talk about this because I know that if I continue talking, I'm not going to sleep tonight, or I'm not going to be able to eat. Being depressed, but not showing their emotions. Not being able to concentrate, having memory problems. Like, I forgot I forgot, was that last year or maybe the year before? I'm not sure if that was at the beginning of the day of my shift or at the end, or just talking too much about being afraid of, of what may happen. Next one. So when these things happen, you openly address these issues. Some of her fears to speak about it, some may be quite realistic. Yes, if she speaks about it, about this, and she's unable to sleep tonight, then that is going to cause us really set a chain of problems tomorrow for her. So should we stop and come back to this another time? Ask her for her suggestions about, what do you think will be best to get the information that I want about this? Will it be better if you just write it up for me and we review it when we meet next week or tomorrow or whenever? Find alternative ways to find out. Uh, is it okay if is there any other way that I can get this information? Maybe I can ask somebody that you talk to, anything that you can do to help her find solutions and not push her beyond what she is capable of doing. Next one. Acknowledge that it's very difficult to talk about this. Be careful not to crush to any pieces her feeling ashamed, her feeling devalued in her workplace, not to really go into any of those things that will make her feel worse. Just be respectful and compassionate. Show that you care, but at the same time, you have to balance your level of friendliness, right? Because you're not a friend. And some of this information, you're going to be using this information for her benefit and for the benefit of other victims, but she has to know that. And you want to be friendly and compassionate, but at the same time, to keep a distance. That is just the professional boundaries that you want so that you also help her feel safe in the relationship with you. And social amenities, for instance, can help. Do you need water? Do you want coffee? Something that will help her feel more comfortable. Next one. This is the one that I already mentioned. When she is feeling very stressed out, very anxious, very fearful, or even angry, you want to engage her about that. Don't just ignore it. What can I do to make you feel better? What are some ways that, this is hard to see here. Oh. What helped you to start feeling better? How can I help you calm down? What does not help you when you are upset? Next one. Okay, and I have a poll also. So when you have a client, Luisa keeps changing her story after her third interview, including jumps in time, names of supervisors. The next few sentences I cannot read. So number 8, is she lying? Is she just forgetful? Does she not have a case? Or I will refer her to an advocate and continue to help. Excellent responses. Everybody says, I will refer her to an advocate and continue to help. Thank you. That's a very, very smart answer. It's exactly that what we see is that she's just unable to keep her story straight because it's just too emotional. And also what happened not only is too emotional when we're talking about it, but sometimes when it happened was so emotional, was so scary that our mind didn't really consolidate it, all the memories of what was happening about it. So that's why it's also very hard to keep the story straight sometimes. Next one. Next one. Maria, you want to move it to the next one? Yeah. When we are interviewing, we want to identify trauma. I think this slide is a little bit too technical, but I'm going to walk you through it. And the reason why I picked this kind of design is because it looks like one of those machines in which those kind of mechanical things can get stuck one on another, and that's what I wanted to convey. Because what trauma really is when we get stuck. We just get stuck in this thing that happened to us, and we cannot move away from it. It's not something that we can just, digest and forget about it. So what happened is that a lot of things are happening to us. One of them is what we call rumination, meaning we just think about it, obsess about it. We start thinking about a different way we could have handled it, about wishing it was different, about what am I going to do now? It's just continue thinking about it. Sometimes we just dream about it or remember just the scene that happened, the situation that happened again and again and again, or talk about it with everybody. We're just talking about it all the time. There's also anxiety, which a lot of our clients will call, I'm just nervous, I'm just jittery, I just jump for no reason, I just feel like I'm jumping out of my skin. And hyperarousal means that like they are expecting for something bad to happen. They're looking around for danger, and they're just feeling like this sense of doom that something terrible is going to happen to me again. They have difficulties focusing, concentrating, remembering things. They want to escape from whatever situation reminds them of the trauma, avoid talking about it. And they also may have physiological problems, which means body and health complaints that are related to the very, very high level of stress they're having, such as headaches, stomach problems, they can't sleep, they can't eat, they're just having a lot of pains, fatigue, and issues that do not have a real physical explanation, a medical explanation. And that together is what we tend to call post-traumatic stress disorder, although it's not the only way that trauma gets expressed. Next one. Don't forget to ask about coercion, because it's sometimes, like Sonia says, it's very hard for them sometimes to identify coercion. They may say, well, he invited me, or he asked me, or well, he asked me if that was okay. But then you want to know more about it. You want to know, what did he say exactly, or how did he say it, or what do you think would have happened if you said no? What do you think would have happened if you just walk away? Because that's the issue here, is that did she really have a choice? Not only a choice, but a reasonable choice, right? Next one. And important to document the trauma that you are going to write down. You're going to put down, how is it that this is how is it normal for a survivor to be unable to provide a linear account, to avoid memories, all these things that may be happening when she's talking to you, not only the content of what she said, but also the manner in which she said it, the nonverbal behavior and the psychological processes that were happening. You also want to put that information in writing. Next one. Again, sometimes there are symptoms that they don't report. They will say, no, everything is fine. This happened to me. I hated it, but I'm okay. But sometimes they're not okay. That's just because they're suppressing their emotions. Sometimes what happens is that you see it in their behavior. You want to call them to finish the interview or for something else. She doesn't answer the calls. She doesn't want to talk about the past. She has no energy for conversation. She doesn't show up in time. She's afraid of the interview. She doesn't show up at all, or she just can't face the interview, or just has difficulty trusting you. Next one, just have two more. One of the ways also to assess the trauma is to ask about, how was it your life before what this happened. You see, I have like a fresh rose and a rose that's dying, that it is just, in bad shape. And just to remind you that sometimes the way that they explain to you how this trauma impacted them is by saying, I used to go out to church after work, and then I just couldn't bring myself to go anymore. Or I used to go in picnics with my children on Sundays, and now I don't have energy for anything. Or I used to be so happy, and I will always be making jokes, and now I don't even talk to anybody. So that will tell you also, how is it that things happen for her psychologically. The next one is about, just when you wrap up, you want to acknowledge that the courage to talk about it. You have to thank them for being so courageous to talk about it. You want to help them. How can they feel safe after the interview? Is there anything that I can help you with that make you feel safer? And also observe how you feel, because as much as this is traumatic for the victim, for the survivor, it can also be traumatic for us to hear about some of these horrendous things that human beings do to other human beings. And that is also something that we need to take care of. Be able to talk to somebody about it, be able to take care of ourselves. And the last slide that I have is a recommendation, is a resource. And this is an example of an interview that shows how a psychologist will interview a victim of, in this case, is domestic violence and sexual assault. But I think that the idea is that you can see some of the techniques that I mentioned being utilized in this role play. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giselle. I really appreciate all of the depth and breadth of information you've given us from the psychological side of things. I think that, this is Jennifer, I think that the contributions that I'll make to this webinar are going to be a little bit more raw, perhaps, because we will get into a little video. I guess I'd like to give you just a little bit of background about what this material is, where it came from, before we get in and start to work with it. This interview is an actress, and it's a woman who is telling her story of sort of a combination of factors, among them an instance of some violence in the workplace, different instances, a collection of different kinds of violence that are impacting her at the workplace. Some of the things that I'd like you to know about this before we actually view it are that the story comes directly from some research, some ethnographic research that I did with immigrant workers living in Iowa. So this is indeed a true story. The reason why we decided to use these stories kind of in a different context, outside of a legal context and outside of a labor union context, is because we found that if you always turn to people who are survivors of sexual violence and keep asking them to tell their story and to retell their story, it often means that they're going to be re-traumatized. One of the women that I worked with when I collected these stories told me one day, listen, I just don't want to talk about it anymore. I don't want to, every time I go back and think about this, it hurts me. So we realized that there's a need for training, there's a need for exposure to these kinds of stories. They help us develop solidarity with workers. They help us in our own knowledge of the real situations that women are facing in the workplace, but they can also actually help us develop our skills as advocates. So we did collect these stories, we put them on video, and there are a lot of interactive techniques you could use to kind of glean information and to glean new ways to work with people on the basis of seeing these interviews. So that's why we did it. And one of the things I wanted to, I guess, start with is in the previous slide, there are a couple of things we might think about before we get into the video. The video is going to be from a very specific workplace. This is a person who actually works in housekeeping in a hotel. So maybe we can take advantage of the questions tool here in the control panel. We did use the polls. Maybe you could try to do the questions tool. When we think about this context, this workplace of the workplace of a housekeeping position, what are some of the potential challenges that a person in a janitorial job or housekeeping job, or even sometimes a domestic worker, might face? Are there some specific risks for that particular workplace? Let's see if we can have any responses here. If we look at the tools, hopefully everybody has some tools on the right-hand panel of their screens. It's called the control panel. And so if I pose the question, what are some potential challenges a worker in housekeeping or in a janitorial profession might face? If you click on the questions tool, there we go, Flavio is answering. There is constant contact with strangers, that's true. You work in a workplace where there may be very few familiar faces. If you work in housekeeping, for example, in a hotel, what are some other issues that might be specific to that workplace? Any kinds of challenges? So another challenge, actually this is coming from some real cases in Las Vegas lately too. People work in isolation. If you're cleaning in a hotel, a lot of times you're isolated. You may be in sort of a hidden workplace where people wouldn't see what you're doing. There are other sorts of safety threats. Maybe you're working with a lot of chemicals. Maybe you're working with actually the materials that you have around you as you work could be a risk. And there are other risks that you might associate with female workers in this workplace, especially if managers are taking advantage of positions of power. I guess another topic that we might want to think about before we get into the interview is sometimes, especially working with immigrant victims of sexual abuse in the workplace, sometimes you find workplace settings where there are partners or family members who are employed at the same firm, the same company. What are some potential workplace problems that could arise if partners work for the same employer? Anybody have any ideas about that? You could post those in the questions tool. Oh, I got some more. That's good. So it's true. Someone is working by themselves a lot of times. What are some of the issues that might arise if you have partners working in the same workplace? Especially thinking of people who are migrants and are part of the workforce. Problems at home. So problems at home can definitely have a direct connection or an indirect connection to issues that a worker would face in the workplace. So you could take those problems with you. So let's say if there's a domestic abuse situation at home, and then you have that partnership working in the same workplace, that can sort of spill over into what happens. Partner could suffer retaliation also if something is reported. So if one member of the team, one member of the family reports, the partner could also suffer retaliation. Those are really good observations. I can tell you really know your stuff about the workforce. So one last question before we get in to this interview. Do workers with children perhaps face special challenges? What issues might a worker with small children think about during her workday? We can use the questions tool again here. For a worker who leaves children at home when she goes off to the workplace, or who has dependents, what are some of the issues that might be at the forefront of her thinking about any kind of workplace issues that she might be facing? Okay, so someone here is noting that we would think that a person who has children who are dependents would be concerned about adequate and affordable daycare. And maybe they're just financial issues, period. You know, maybe someone would be willing to put up with challenges, threats, violence at the workplace if they had dependents at home who are depending on that job. If she's just not earning money only for herself, but also to provide for family, that would certainly increase the sense of risk. What will I lose if I speak up? So I guess we could go on to the next slide. These are actually the follow-up questions, so I think we'll go on to the video, which is in the following slide. And this is going to be a scene of an interview where a woman tells her story of some things that are happening in her workplace.
When I arrived at the hotel, I had to watch a video, and then I started to work. They expected me to clean really fast, but I had no idea how to do anything. They screamed at me, but I said to myself, if this is what I have to do to care for my children, I'll do it.
Didn't the other people help you or show you how to do the cleaning?
Oh no, we couldn't talk at work. There was a manager. He was so impatient. He would start saying,
Hey, quiet, quiet!
He would scream at us and call us names.
Watch the noise, bitch!
He would come in and start saying,
Work it, finish your room, come on! Look, faster, bitch.
The more he would yell, the more he would shake and turn red. But I worked well. Still, every day was like a nightmare when I worked there.
What in particular?
How do you say? There was also a lot of grabbing and touching and invitations.
Sexual harassment?
So if you worked there, you never knew what could happen to you. There was a manager, a man with a wife and kids, but he was always chasing after the younger women. He would threaten to take their jobs if they didn't do what he wanted.
Did he ever approach you?
Yes. At first he said he just wanted to take me out to dinner to spend some time alone with me. And if I said no, I would lose my job and so would my husband.
So what did you do?
I just laughed and I told him no because there weren't any restaurants in town good enough for me. But then, one night, I got off work earlier than my husband, and so the manager followed me out to the parking lot. There was no one around, and so he came up behind me, and he grabbed me by the hips. He said to me,
You were just playing hard to get. But I know that you want me.
No,
You've
I don't!
always wanted me.
Let go of me!
Do you want to lose your job?
Then some other workers came into the parking lot and saw what was happening. He just straightened up and walked away.
Did you ever report this?
Are you kidding? I didn't want to lose my job or my husband's either.
So you can see that indeed these are actors. I like to remind people when they see the video because the people who tell the stories, who act out these stories, aren't actually the people who were impacted. So I guess it's good to keep that in mind. It was especially hard for the men who did this, who aren't actually predators, but they did have to act those parts. So I like to keep that in mind when we talk about them. So what do you observe in this workplace setting? I'm going to pose a question and ask you to respond in the question box if you'd like to. What do you observe in terms of just any kind of violence in this workplace? What are some of the moments in the video that show you that this is an unhappy workplace, a workplace that has lots of different kinds of aggressive behavior? Did anybody notice any words or actions that would lead you to believe that this is a workplace where there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of violence? Okay, so there, Fabio says that there is belittling. So there is verbally abusive behavior. The first manager is demeaning. He uses vulgar language. He also, yes, there's no training. So this person arrives on a workplace where there are some specific tools that you need to do your job. We have this in the scene where she's actually got a cart full of tools and specific cleaning supplies. There's no training. She's just thrown into this. Any other observations about, okay, there's a strong fear. The woman goes to this workplace already feeling fearful. So there may have been a pattern of events that lead up to this. She's just starting to tell the interviewer about the different types of things that she's facing. So, and when we think in terms of sexual violence, what specifically happens in terms of sexual violence at the workplace? In the face. Yeah, that's another thing. The first manager, when he comes on the scene, his physical space between the worker and the manager is very small. He's right in her face. He's screaming at her. When we turn to to think about, there's sort of a series of flashbacks where the woman is telling her story about a second manager. What are the specific issues that you could identify in terms of sexual violence in the workplace with regard to the second manager? I'll pose that question. I'll look here for maybe some people to respond. The second manager appears on the scene. Did anybody notice anything specific to that second manager? Unwanted touching. He does definitely approach her and he grabs her. Anything else? I'm going to see if I get any responses here. He knows what he did was wrong. That's an interesting comment from Michelle Sims. Which he are we talking about? The first manager or the second manager? Who knows what he did was wrong? Yes, he stopped afterwards. So when the second manager isolates the worker, he has her alone in the dark in a parking lot, he stops when he sees that other people are going to witness what he's doing. Another thing, an interesting dynamic, apparently, judging by the manager's words, he believes that the female worker is attracted to him due to his statement. This is how the actual woman that I spoke to reported this. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, and actually he stopped after a second, he seems like a manager that would retaliate against employees that report. One of the things that Giselle actually pointed out to me when she viewed this interview is something that we need to keep in mind, and that is that sometimes there's actually a pattern of violence in the workplace, so that were this worker to try to report to the first manager, she certainly wouldn't sense any sort of support from that individual. So we've got a workplace that's sort of shot through with a bunch of different kinds of threats to the worker. So she would feel very insecure and very isolated in that workplace. One more kind of question here. When you think about how these issues function together and you think about how this woman responds, how could we intervene in this situation? What are some of the words we could say or the resources we could use to intervene with a worker who's facing these sort of multiple layers of violence in the workplace? What are some ideas you would have to help Beatriz feel less vulnerable or help her feel a little bit more empowered in her workplace? What are some first steps you would take? I'm going to look here at this tool and see if we're getting any responses. What are some first steps you would take to intervene in a situation like this? What are some resources you might turn to? I would work to get her to be able to have a buddy. That's a really good safety concern. Build some sort of a network of workers within that space. Try to find some sort of an ally or a buddy in the workplace. Michelle Sims says I would let her know she didn't do anything wrong. Those are really good initial responses to how to think about how to change these dynamics in the workplace. So one of the things we were hoping to get out of showing the video is just to consider that there are always multiple factors at play. Sometimes the workplace has an interface with what's going on at home, so there are direct implications between the domestic space and the workplace. Sometimes there are multiple people involved, so there's actually more than one manager. Sometimes there are multiple workers impacted by these situations. So I think that with that, we could probably move on to the next slide. And I think Lauren is up.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you, that was really interesting, Jennifer. Since we're coming towards the end of the presentation, I will not spend a whole lot of time on some of these topics, not only because we covered them recently in our last webinar, although I know some people weren't on that, but also because our next webinar is going to be very legal heavy. And so I really want to focus on the role of the EEOC in helping workers and who are dealing with these issues, and the role you all as organizers can play in making sure that workers are able to go into the EEOC with their best case, with the best evidence, and putting themselves in the best position to be able to be compensated and remedied for what they went through. And I think a lot of, what I'm going to talk about today is going to go hand in hand with what Jennifer and Giselle have been talking about. So when you're having these initial conversations with workers, when you've discovered that they have been the victim of sexual harassment, obviously, you have to be very sensitive when you're asking questions. You want to make sure you're providing, as we're saying, holistic support, and really making sure that, you're not only focusing on kind of the concrete things, but also emotions and psychological damage. But I think while you're doing that, you can also do things that are going to help ensure that workers are not giving up any of their legal rights and are in a position to vindicate their legal rights. And I think as organizers, you're already in a place where you're telling workers to keep notes, or you're telling workers to keep documents and make sure that they're protecting their other rights at work. And so I think this is going to be something that you can very naturally work into your conversations when you are talking to survivors of sexual violence at work. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, just ways that you can make sure you're being proactive about collecting information and building a potential legal case for workers who are survivors of violence. Next slide, please. So documenting cases of sexual violence. I talked about the elements of a legal claim for sexual harassment under Title VII last week. And that's really, the kinds of things you should be thinking about when you're asking questions, when you're telling people to look for documents, and when you're helping a worker really organize a case that they could potentially file with the EEOC. And so the strength of a legal claim really depends on the strength of the evidence you have. I mean, so often, unfortunately, these cases are he said, she said. But I think there are ways that you can even bolster those cases if you're proactive about collecting evidence as close to after the incident of violence has happened. And so when you're assisting workers with potential claims, or when you're having these conversations, you should think about, you should be thinking about in the back of your mind, even if this isn't, front and center of what the conversation is, what things they would need to show to make out their case. If they were going to talk to someone who wasn't you, who wasn't their advocate, what would we need to show them to prove that they're right, to prove that they're telling the truth? And so I want to take a step back and talk a little, go back over some of the elements of the sexual harassment claim under Title VII. And so in order to show sexual harassment in a hostile work environment, you have to show that harassment was either severe or pervasive. And so we've been talking a lot about severe types of sexual violence and sexual harassment. That's where there is a full-on rape, a sexual assault, something, physical and very, very traumatic. And so I think to the extent that, workers are going to the hospital, they're, reporting it to the police, they're doing something that is what you would, is what some people would do if they've experienced a violent rape. Those are documents, that's evidence. That's something that's going to prove that a severe form of harassment happened to them. And so I think, when you're, having these sensitive conversations, even if that's not front and center for the worker, if you can work in a question like, oh, you went to the hospital, do you have any documents from that? And you can be the one who holds on to that and keeps that all together, because obviously, a lot of other things are going to be going on with the worker, and that's not going to, filing a legal claim most of the time is not going to be someone's principal concern when they're dealing with this type of trauma. So that's really a role you can play as an organizer, when you're having these conversations. If it's pervasive, so, that's something that maybe doesn't amount to a rape, but it's, daily comments. The video that Jennifer showed where they're getting asked out on a regular basis, or just, where it's very verbal. So that's going to be a he said, she said situation a lot of the time. The things that are going to bolster that is if, the worker writes down every comment that they hear. We tell workers to write down when their, when their boss is clocking them out or when their overtime is being stolen. Even though this is very sensitive, I think it's important that we try to empower workers to write this type of thing down too. Even if it's too uncomfortable to write exactly what's said, if they can just write the date and write the manager or the coworker who said it, that's going to put them in a really good position if they want to show that this is happening going forward. Or even if they've opened up to you and they've told you about what's going on, tell the worker to text you every time something new happens. And it doesn't have to be a full gruesome story, but if they can just say, hey, something happened to me again, you can help them create that evidence. You can be a witness. And I think it's, as sensitive as these things are, the workers are going to be in a position where they can vindicate their rights if they have this type of evidence at their disposal. Next slide, please. So, another element that we have to show in order to prove a sexual harassment case is that the employer knew or should have known. And so, to the extent that workers are in a position where they're going to HR, where they've, overcome so much to be able to complain about this and to be able to make a formal complaint to their boss, that's really where we want to, as we're supporting workers, really encourage them to make a record of it. So when they go down and they're having a meeting with their supervisor, who's not their harasser, or they're having a conversation with someone in HR, we should advise them to record it. I don't know how often you all tell workers to record meetings, but when I was at the Fight for 15, if it was a state where you could, where the single party consent state, where that means only one person who's part of the conversation has to be okay with recording, then I always said record every meeting. Just bring your iPhone, just turn on the video or the voice memo function or the voice memo app you have, and just hold your phone and to the extent you can, just record as much of it as you can. Another thing is making copies of any documents or complaints that you're filing with HR that are regarding the sexual assault or sexual harassment you're dealing with. So, I mean, not everyone has access to a really nice, photocopier, but to the extent, workers have phones, have, smartphones or iPhones, where they can take a quick picture of the document, or even if you have a phone, just say, hey, can you bring that document? And then you can take a picture of it and you'll be the person holding that evidence for them. So I think that's the best practice to make a record of any complaints that are happening. So, when the worker goes to the EOC, when the worker goes to court, the company can't say, this is the first time we're hearing about this. You'll be able to say, no, actually I spoke with, HR representative Ava on this date, and here's my recording of it. Or, oh, here's the complaint I filed on this date. It's not the clearest picture, but I've got a picture of it. Another thing that, is really important is to talk about witnesses. So much of this, people who commit sexual harassment and assault at work are usually smart enough not to do it in front of other people. But that's not always the case, especially in some workplaces, whether, janitors are really isolated, but a lot of the times, they might be working in the same space and someone might overhear something. And witnesses can also be people who have also experienced similar harassment, and people who could also bring a claim. So if you have, 10 women who are working in a workplace, sadly, it's probably not the only person who is experiencing harassment isn't the worker who's reported it to you. There's probably, 2, 3, 4, 5 other women who are dealing with the exact same thing, and they can be a witness and someone who can bolster the worker's case. So think about that too. Cameras at work sites, if you're having a conversation with a worker and they're at the point where they want to file an EEOC claim, really ask them to say, are there surveillance cameras? Is there any way this could have been caught on camera? Like when I was working on the Fight for 15, there are usually cameras over the registers in most fast food restaurants. And so that was actually a really good source of evidence for us on a regular basis, because a worker could be like, oh yeah, that happened right in front of the register and he came up behind me and the camera would have caught that, and they only, record over the video every 2 months. It should still be there. And then obviously if there are text messages or phone calls or anything that where the harasser is making a record on their own, encourage workers to save that. You know, sometimes these things are disgusting, they're gross, you don't want to keep them on your phone. So, you know, advise the worker, just, you know, send the picture to me, send the text to me, then you can delete it so you don't have to look at it anymore. But it's important to keep a hold of those things, as upsetting as they can be, just because they're really good evidence if you go to the EOC and try to make a case. Next slide, please. So now I want to kind of just take a couple steps back and really go over, you know, what the EEOC's role can be in this process, and kind of what your role can be in helping a worker go to the EEOC. And so I will just reiterate something that, you know, we discussed in the last webinar. Sexual violence and assault in the workplace is a form of sexual harassment. So, you know, these problems that we're seeing, they are not only criminal, which most of the time it is, or often it can be criminal. It's also a civil action that workers can bring and recover money for. And as I mentioned, I kept saying Title VII. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits race, color, sex, national origin, and religious discrimination. And sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination under Title VII. And the EEOC has a really interesting role here. So the EEOC is a gatekeeper to federal court. The EEOC is going to be your first line of defense. It's going to be the first stop you take if for a worker who has experienced sexual harassment who wants to bring a claim and vindicate their rights. You know, where criminal cases are going to go after the individual who is engaged in the conduct, the civil lawsuit is going to go after the company for the money and to make sure there are changes in the company. So, you know, the company is the deep pockets, and, you know, no amount of money is going to make harassment or assault okay. But it can encourage a company. It can be you know, something that, you know, finally makes a company think this is important. You know, they might not care about workers, but they care about their bottom line. And if they're losing money because they have to pay out sexual harassment lawsuits, you know, they're going to make sure that workplaces are safer for women. And so I think even though the amount of money workers are getting from a sexual harassment lawsuit might not make a difference on an individual basis, this could make a huge difference in making sure companies, you know, take proactive action to make sure women are safe at work. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the EEOC, it is actually recognized that sexual assault in the workplace is a huge problem. And it's identified in its 2012 National Strategic Enforcement Plan that immigrant women, migrants, and other types of vulnerable workers should be their priority, because these are the people who are being targeted by harassers. These are the people who are likely not going to, you know, go out and seek an EEOC charge by themselves. So whenever they get something, if they get some kind of complaint, they're more likely going to go in and really do a deep investigation and talk to more people than they might otherwise in a different, you know, industry for different types of workers. The industries that the EEOC is still particularly interested in are agriculture, service industries, restaurants, and janitorial work. And they've identified, you know, how important it is to work with public interest groups and advocates. You know, sexual assault program staff may be the first line to identify harassment. So, you know, and I think that means unions, right? I mean, you guys are at the forefront, as I keep saying, of you're the people who workers talk to about problems in their workplace. If someone's going to, you know, be hearing about these problems and hearing about these problems from a lot of people, it's going to be you. And so I think the EEOC has really identified that, and you can really play a very important role in linking workers and the EEOC together to make sure that workplaces and companies are respecting women's rights. Next slide, please. So as I said, a big part of filing a claim, a civil claim, is there's going to be remedies, you know, remedies for the worker, and some kind of enforcement mechanism for the company. And so what we typically think of when we think of remedies are monetary remedies, so money. Remedy is money for victims of harassment. That's back pay if they get fired, that's reinstatement if they get fired, it's compensatory damages if, you know, you can prove emotional distress, pain, and suffering. And when you're talking about sexual harassment, that's almost always going to be there. And then there's also punitive damages, and that's the kind of damages I've been talking about, where the company is being punished for allowing this to go on in its workplace. And those are capped at $300,000. So, you know, I'm thinking about ABM, janitorial service, like, I mean, that's probably, or building management services. That's a drop in the bucket for them. But that could be a lot for the subcontractor that ABM is working with. And so we should always remember that when we're thinking about, you know, why it's important to move forward, and when we're talking to workers about why it's important to bring claims. And a remedy may also include money for those who are retaliated against as witnesses. So I think, you know, to the extent witnesses are hesitant, just always remind them that they have a course of action too if they're retaliated against. And then for non-monetary remedies, so new company policies to encourage complaints without fear of retaliation, a bar from rehiring the harasser, discipline, and termination of the harasser. So even if the worker, you know, you're advising and you're helping, is kind of hesitant to file a charge, and they're just like, I don't care about the money, it's always important to remind them that this is bigger than money. And, you know, like every other conversation you have with a worker about why it's important to stand up in their workplace, this is the same thing. You're doing this for everybody. You're making things better for everybody. You're making, you know, you're stronger together. And I think, you know, when you're talking about the remedies, there might be times when it's more important to focus the non-monetary remedies, how you can make something better in your workplace if you come forward. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these selected cases. These really are just a great example that Sonia pulled together of what's possible, you know, when workers come together and when worker advocates come forward and expose problems in a workplace. So the, you know, EEOC versus Tanimura and Antley, you know, it was $1.855 million settlement, and California Rural Legal Assistance was the entity that really pulled those claims together and filed them with the EEOC. And then the EEOC went forward and litigated the cases on behalf of the workers. Same with the Coster Farms. This was Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They were the ones who did the interviews, pulled together the information, filed the charges all at once, and got the EEOC involved. Same with Riviera Farms, Harris Farms, you know, ABM, National Food Corps, Monterey Gourmet Foods, all of the, and there's tons of more cases if you go to EEOC.gov. And so I think that's why it's so important that organizers and unions are really paying attention to systemic problems in the workplace. If one worker doesn't want to come forward, but it's happening to everyone in the workplace, you really just need to find one worker who's willing to go on the record, and then you can say, this is happening to a lot of different people, and you can initiate the EEOC to undertake an investigation and then pursue litigation on behalf of all these workers if you can just get one. That's the role the EEOC can play. So we're going to do a quick poll here. Oh, okay. So how long do most workers have to file it? Oh, God. Okay, how long do sorry about that. Oh, no worries. We're almost there with the poll. So I want to just see what you guys think about filing charges. So how long do you think most workers have to file a charge? Can we pull up the poll?
I think we have closed the poll by mistake, so I don't know if Maria can.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So how long do most workers have to, thank you so much, Maria. How long do most workers have to file an EEOC charge after they've been harassed? Do you think it's 200 days, 3 years, 180 days, or a month? I'll look over here and see if folks are voting.
Yes, but it's
close. It's anonymous. It is anonymous,
okay.
So we don't know what you're saying. Go ahead.
We haven't covered this information either, so it's fine. Okay, well, it's fine if folks folks don't want to vote, but we'll just go ahead and cover it then. So filing a charge, you have 180 days for the most part. You should assume that's your standard. California, Arizona, some of the more progressive states, they have 300 days from the last act of harassment, but most places have 180 days, so C would be the correct answer. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So I just want to go over, what filing a charge looks like and the role you can play. So the charges is what notifies the EEOC to investigate. They will always investigate, even if they don't think it seems like that good of claim. If you put together something that looks like sexual harassment, looks like race discrimination, looks like religious discrimination, as long as you're alleging that on the face of the charge, the EEOC is going to investigate it. And so you can go to eeoc.gov, and if you go to the individual regions for the EEOC, it'll show you their preferred method of filing, but usually mail, walk-in, letter from an advocacy group, all of those things are sufficient to initiate an investigation. And third-party charges, advocacy groups, churches, unions, you can file one. A union can file a charge on behalf of its members. So always remember that. A commissioner's charge, that's something that the EEOC commissioner will pursue if they hear about a problem or if they think there's a problem that's worth investigating. Class members, EEOC can gather information regarding named and unidentified class members if the complaint alleges that there's a class of workers similarly situated. I'm remembering with the Fight for 15 sexual harassment program, we did that often. We'd have one worker who was willing to come forward, but 10 or 15 other women who are dealing with the same thing in that franchise. We could just, anonymously talk about their issues, say which store their location was, and have them move forward based on those allegations. And as I mentioned, the charge must be filed within 180 days after the last act of harassment. A lot of these situations are going to be ongoing situations, but it's important to be aware of that date. Next slide, please. Okay, so key issues in an EEOC investigation. And this is what you should, when I was mentioning collecting information, documenting evidence, these are the things you should be thinking about when you're talking to workers about what they should, bring and what they should be thinking about as you're, thinking about bringing a claim. So did harassment occur? That's what they're going to be looking for. So the severe, the pervasive, did the company know about it? Did charging party complain to supervisor or HR? Did the employer fail to protect the employee from harassment, and why? Is the harasser a top official? So that's a situation where the charging party wouldn't have to, file a complaint or really, assert that there is a problem in order for the company to be liable. And did the employer or its agents threaten the charging party if she complained? Or if any witnesses provided information on their behalf. Next slide, please. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but proving harassment, one of the most important things is, is the charging party credible? Do not assume that the charging party is lying, but when you're going to the EEOC, that's going to be a question that they're going to be asked by their investigator. And it can be very uncomfortable. And I think the more that you can bring in other people who can bolster the worker's claim or evidence that bolsters the worker's claim, the better situation they're going to be in, and the easier it is going to be for the EEOC investigator to find that they're credible. I think emotionally upset, crying, there's no one way for a rape victim to react, but I think that's something that, is going to be relevant. That's something that the investigator is going to look to and say, is this person acting like someone who suffered a sexual assault at work? Describing details. These are hard to describe and explain. It's very sensitive, but when a worker's before the EEOC investigator, they're going to be asking these questions, like where did they touch you? How often did it happen? Where specifically are you talking about? What specifically did they say? And I think preparing workers to, as you're encouraging workers, it's also important that you be forthcoming about what exactly they're going to have to say when they get before an investigator and when their claims are being investigated. any threats by the harasser. I think, investigators are trained to ask about this, but it's important that you also prepare workers to be able to go in there and tell their story and talk about things that maybe aren't naturally going to come up in a conversation about harassment, including retaliation. Next slide, please. Other things when you're looking to prove harassment: post-traumatic stress, any physical injuries, if there's medical treatment, need for ongoing medical and psychological treatment. This might make the EEOC more interested in investigating the case because it can prove, possible pain and suffering damages that might make the EEOC more interested in litigating the case. Evidence that bolsters credibility to establish liability and damages, like I said, witnesses, cameras, anything that I think is really going to say, if it is a he said, she said situation, make the she said look more viable. The evidence can also support a claim for compensatory damages, as I mentioned, emotional distress, pain and suffering. And this is something that you could possibly be a witness for. Union organizers, someone who's been the first point of contact, someone who's a confidant, you can really talk about the ways that that the assault or the harassment has done long-term damage. The Willamette Tree Wholesale case is an example of this. There is a testimony of a psychologist, Fabiana Wallace, and a therapist documented trauma caused by, multiple rapes and threats to kill farm worker and her families. This helped the case, and this helped bolster the claim for damages. Next slide, please. And then also, you've got to think about who the EEOC, when they're investigating these claims and litigating these claims, it's not going to be one-sided. The harasser is going to have a chance to prove their side of the story and tell their side of the story, and they're going to, be coming forward with their information. So you have to think about the case that they're going to put on. Is the harasser someone who's going to be, really charming and believable? And, those are things to think about when you're pulling together the claim and kind of putting the investigator on notice about what they should be, what they can expect. And while you're developing your evidence, what evidence can you have that's going to undercut the harasser's credibility? In terms of the company's response, do you have any information that the harasser has been previously disciplined or not? So, something that was really common in the Fight for 15 when we were running our sexual harassment field program, a lot of within franchises, managers would be moved around, when they would harass women, and it would get so bad there'd be complaints, and they'd say, oh, I'm just going to send them to my 12th Street store now. And workers actually, I think, had a pretty good sense of this from talking to each other within the campaign, even if they worked at different stores. And so I think, thinking about ways you can get information about their past conduct is helpful. And also the company's training, that's something the workers are going to know about. Was I trained on how to report this complaint? If you are in contact with any managers, are managers trained on how to not harass people and handle complaints when they're reported? Are they told not to retaliate? I think, if you can get your hands on training guides, manuals, employee manuals, that's going to be helpful in improving the company's response. And so, the EEOC, when they're investigating this, they can subpoena all this information, but the more that you go in to the EEOC investigator and say, here's what we got, so they know what to ask for and they already know what they're looking for, the stronger your case is going to be, the more likely they're going to take on and litigate your case. Next slide, please. All right, another poll. I don't know if we can pull up the poll. Okay, what type of evidence will support a worker's claim for sexual harassment? A, witnesses, B, police reports about the alleged harassment, C, internal complaints about harassment, or D, all of the above. All right, we have a good amount saying D, all of the above, which is correct. Thank you. All right, I think that is my last slide, but next slide. Okay, yes, this is some of the information I've already covered, but when you're proving your case, think about witnesses and have the worker think about witnesses. So you might have actual witnesses, but a lot of time it's going to be coworkers, supervisors, just people who maybe experience the same thing, or even just people you talk to about this when it happened, who can, provide, say that, while this was going on, she talked to me about this, 6 times, 7 times. This isn't something that was recently fabricated or something she's just recently bringing up. This is something she's talked about for 2 years. That's going to help a worker's case. Counselors and doctors, as we mentioned in the Willamette case, that's something that can help bolster a claim. Parents, spouses, and relatives, once again, just someone who the worker was talking to about this, so they can't say, oh, this is a recent fabrication because she didn't get a raise, or because the organizers are going into the workplace and stirring up trouble. So, if there's any record of prior consistent, statements about this, even if it's from someone who's kind of interested, like a parent, a spouse, or a relative, it's still going to be helpful. And once again, other harassed individuals, these are going to be the workers, other workers who maybe aren't the one who came forward to you. And, the worker who did come forward to you might know of other people in the workplace who've experienced this. So I think it's always important to, be having that conversation about who else, and making sure that you're trying to elicit that from workers when you're talking to them about these problems and talking to them about developing a case. Next slide, please. Okay, and so I'll just quickly talk about this. Once I said, evidence of a severe harassment, a police report, that those, typically aren't really filed even in very egregious, serious sexual assault crimes. So it's unlikely that the worker did this, but it's possible. So ask if the cops got involved, if they filed a police complaint, that can really help their case. And in EOC versus Harris Farms, 3 rapes by a supervisor, the deputy sheriff said, the workers are lying, but the jury still believes them. So even if the cops are called, there is a report filed, and the police don't do anything with it, the jury could still come to a different conclusion. And the fact that they went to the sheriff in the first place is still going to help their case, even if the sheriff is saying, we didn't find, beyond a reasonable doubt or enough evidence to file charges. Juries are going to be instructed that it's a different standard, and that shouldn't dissuade you from going forward with a civil case. Next slide. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. I know that we should have 7 days at least to cover everything that we have in this webinar. So I just want to be conscious of your time, and I don't want to keep you. Just briefly, if we can go to the next slide. Actually, let's go to the resource list. I have prepared in there a series of slides and information, little unusual team map that you can see in there with everybody that has been pulled in to our cases. And I will talk more about this since we're going to be doing the legal piece, the final legal remedies during the next webinar. I think it's still relevant how to build partnership. But if we can move on to the next slide, Maria, to the resources, just wanted to make sure that you know that there are lots of exciting things happening around the nation, and that all these agencies and organizations that are listed in your resource list are currently working on labor issues related to victimization, as in sexual harassment and sexual violence. So I invite you to either take a few minutes to go to their web pages, or as you are having cases and your cases are developing and you're building partnerships, go to these websites. We'd love to help you here at Assista. That's what we do, and that's why we thought this webinar with your collaboration was so crucial to bring the information and who is a good partner in the field today for your cases is. So we have more to come, and please don't miss our last series of webinars. And I'm just gonna have Debbie now closing. And thank you so much for your patience. I know we went way over the time. And Debbie?
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate you being on the call to the bitter end. I know that you were an enthusiastic crowd, and we really appreciate your time. Please do join us for the March 8th webinar, and a special thanks again to Lauren, Giselle, Sonia, and Jennifer for their incredible help in making this webinar so great. Thanks, everybody, and hope to talk to you on March 8th. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.